I have the pleasure of introducing our first invited panel of the day, Brain Development in a Digital World. We often hear about observable outcomes like behavior, but underlying these observable patterns are complex neurological processes that begin taking shape even before we are born. I look forward to hearing from this group of experts on critical periods of brain development and how they intersect with digital media use across childhood. Please join me in welcoming the panel to the stage, Dr. Heather Kirkorian, Dr. Tzipi Horowitz-Kraus, and Dr. Lucía Magis-Weinberg.
Morning, everybody. Thanks for getting up first thing on a Monday morning to be here with us. It's good to see you all. My name is Heather. I am not a neuroscientist. I need to say that right away. I'm a developmental scientist, which means I think a lot about change over time and multiple time scales, both processes that unfold in the moment and longer-term change that accumulates through experience across weeks and months and years. It also means I think about development as a dynamic and reciprocal process where kids both affect and are affected by their environment. And I think this perspective blends well with the neuroscientific perspective. And I think both of those worlds together, if we connect them more seamlessly, can help us interpret the small but growing literature we have in neuroscientific evidence in our field. And that's why I'm excited to invite these two wonderful speakers to talk to us today, because they both bring both of those perspectives together in a way that I think will help all of us interpret this research and apply it in our practice and our research a little bit better. So I'm going to give them plenty of time to talk and get out of your way. Tzipi, please join us.
Good morning, everybody. I've been told that I can use the microphone as well. Okay, so good morning, everybody, and it's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation. I've been part of Children's Screens forever, it feels like, and it's such a pleasure to be here in person. So I'm gonna start off really quickly because I have like tons of slides for you and I don't wanna miss anything, but I will start with something visual. This is not a lemon, it's a brain. Squishy brain. And what would you say if I tell you that there is an organ in our body that within 3 to 4 years, it multiplies its size by almost 4 or 5, right? Imagine that this is the baby's brain, fetus brain, and this is the size of a brain of an adult, and this child's brain reaches this size by the age of 5. So this is pretty tremendous, right? You would say, well, what is this organ? I want to fuel this organ with tons of love and rich environmental stimulation. So this is how I want to start. These are my disclosures, mainly the funders that funded our studies. And I will start with a quick introduction about the brain, critical aspect of brain development and some cognitive and sensory processes important for child development. I will then move on to synchronization, which is the body of my work, basically. Synchronization within systems, within the growing child, and synchronization between systems, between parent and child. And I will show you some brain markers for that. I hope I will have enough time to show you some really, really cool preliminary results from our study looking at the child's brain, talking to ChatGPT and the scanner. So stay super tuned. So let's start. Brain development is magical. I absolutely love my job. I truly believe that whatever we give to our kids at a very early age has lots of fruits down the road afterwards. And we look at brain development as a continuum. I know that Lucy will speak about adolescents and I'm going to talk about kids, but it's really young kids. It's really a continuum. And whenever we feed the young brain in early ages, we will really see the trajectory of the outcome down the road. And so what you see here on the slide is the basic ability that start developing from really early age: sensory motor, language, social emotional attention, basic attention abilities. And then we have executive functions. We will talk about all of these aspects later on. And these sets off the foundation for academic skills in school. So what does it take to really reach the hand on this mobile? Hopefully it's not an electronic mobile that for the young child, what does it take? So it takes a lot. It's not easy. Sensory motor development is the first one to kick in. Basically, the abilities to integrate sensory input into motoric action. You see the trajectory here. I'm not going to go into each one of the steps. It's really mainly for you. But you see that there is a specific brain region that is in charge of sensory motor development, somewhere in the frontal region of our brain. Then we're talking about language development milestones. And you see, again, from cooing to verbal cues, and then to words, and then to sentences. And there's a huge trajectory that I can continue drawing if I had more slides or a larger slide. And the neurobiological correlates for these linguistic abilities are located also in frontal regions and temporal regions. Language is really spread out all over the brain. It's not in a single region. It's actually in a network. And I will talk about these networks down the road. Executive functions are always the trickiest. First of all, is it function or functions? There are neuropsychologists that have a whole conversation and a talk about that, whether it's singular, plural. For our use, this is a general term that describes several sub-abilities, lower level or more basic and more higher level, that supports learning from our mistakes, learning moving forward, and improve our performance. Executive functions reach the full maturation by the age of, someone knows? 26. Yeah. Think about all the decisions that you made before that age. Our brain reaches the peak of the maturation at the age of 26, when frontal regions that traditionally are related to executive functions get fully connected to more far regions related to visual processing at the back of our brain. And that happens at the age of 26. This is why it's so hard for little kids to stay still, to pay attention for a long time, and so on. And you see the full developmental trajectory on the screen. Social emotional development starts from early steps, early ages. It includes empathic behavior, emotion regulation, which is also related a little bit to executive functions, and the region related to this several abilities is the amygdala, or the source of our emotion. But not only, as I said, it's all about the networks, and we will talk about that in a minute. So, this is my little Noga, my little daughter. How can we objectively quantify these abilities? And I think this is the strength of neuroimaging data. You know, in school, in class, at home, what we usually see is the behavior, which is amazing, right? This is what we want to see. But to the behavior, there are several causes can actually cause the same behavior, right? So what we see is really the tip of the iceberg, and then the mechanisms, which we can reveal using questionnaires and tests. Sometimes it's hard to pinpoint objectively at these mechanisms if we only use behavioral or observational tasks. Neuroimaging data enable us to look at mechanisms while the child is performing a certain task, not outside of this activity, but during. How do we do that? So there are huge protocols about how to get kids involved in research. What we do, we work with kids that are healthy. We're working also with kids with developmental disorders, but we work with healthy kids. They don't have to come over. They come over voluntarily, right? And they need to be super engaged. So there are huge protocols. If you want, catch me after. I'm sure I will get you super excited about that. And we get them in. We do. It's a game. It's a long game, but you need to have lots of energies for that. And then we get these. We have several imaging tools that we can use. During this presentation, I will show you some data from two neuroimaging tools. One is MRI, as you see to your right. The other one is EEG, that you see to your left. MRI, for those who don't know, that we use for our research is the same MRI that is used clinically. However, we have a special function that enables us to track the blood that reaches specific active regions in the brain without injecting anything, just by using the characteristics of our body and our brain, that regions in the brain that work harder get more blood, oxygenated blood, and we can measure it using MRI. So functional MRI is a regular MRI with an extra function that we use. EEG, on the other hand, is also looking at the same brain activation, but using a different method. Our brain is working on electricity, basically. The transmission between the cells, between the nerve cells, is through electrical signal. And using EEG is basically putting some speakers on our scalp, and these speakers amplify the electrical signal that our brain transmits. So 2 tools, same brain, and you're gonna see lots of images like that on the screen. Now, whenever I'm gonna show a slide with a certain tool, I will have a small icon so you know whether it's an MRI study or an EEG study, just to get you more involved in what you see. So, multiple neurobiological changes along development, such as what? First of all, as I explained at the beginning, the brain reaches the size of 92% of the size of the adult brain by the age of 5. So an actual increase in volume, which is quite amazing. What's happening inside? So if I can have a small microscope to look inside a child's brain, what I would see is that the cells in the brain, nerve cells, start communicating with each other. This process is called synaptogenesis. And I always say that nerve cells are the most social cells ever because they want to talk to the other cells next to them. This process of synaptogenesis is happening to its fullest in the first years of life. Then, after a couple of years, there's a pruning process, which means that it's like a cut of synapses that are not in use. If we look at the abilities that I talked to you earlier, sensory, motor, and cognitive control, or executive functions, and language, and more, you will see that there is a different trajectory in development of these regions, also when we're looking at the brain. So you see in this slide that there's sensory, motor, and blue picks the first, because this is the first ability to develop, and then linguistic abilities, and then executive functions. I promised you that we're going to talk about networks, because just looking at brain activation is a little bit of a simplistic way of looking at things. We now know the more the field is developed, the more we know about what's happening in the brain. And so we know today that there's no a single region that is related to this ability or that ability, but these are networks. What does network mean? It means that several regions speak together, talk to each other, get blood at the same time. And we know today that if we look at the longitudinal, as I said, a continuum trajectory of development, we can see that already in the fetal brain, and I know Mariah Thomason talked in this conference a couple of years ago. I'm a great fan, and she's a great friend. She is looking into the fetus brain, and she already recognized that in the fetus brain we can see the networks related to visual processing and auditory processing and somatomotor and default mode. And remember this default mode because we're going to go back to it. It's related to cognitive ability as well and attention. In the fetus brain we see an increase within the network, which means increase in functional connection. Regions start talking to each other. It continues in early childhood, and then during adolescent time that Lucy will talk about, the networks start communicating with each other, okay? So this is a long process, and think about the points that you can affect these processes over childhood and adolescence. And as I said, we will talk about the default mode afterwards. And then if we talk about the overall structure of the brain, the peak that the brain reaches its structural thickness, how thick the cortex is. Our cortex is folded. That's why we have this folded brain here. It is folded And it reaches the peak of the thickness of it by the age of 2. So this is very dramatic. These are the important ages. Now, tracking the time that I have, I can say that if we look at the young brain from birth until 5 months, and this is what you see here, each row is basically an age range. So we have 1 month, 2 months until 5, and then the bottom one is adulthood. See how beautifully the networks exist already at the age of 1 month and then 2 and so on. And it almost looks the same as in the adult's brain. And why am I telling you all of this? Because when we say that it's important to make sure that the environment of the child fits the developmental phase that the child is at, it's because the brain is ready to capture all this information. Now, I want to show you a short video that was produced by Cincinnati Children's Hospital, where I used to work. And you could see how complex activities like reading, how they integrate all these sub-abilities that I just talked about: executive functions, sensory motor, language and phonology, semantics, cognitive control and executive functions. All these regions communicate with each other. So it's not just that they are active, they need to speak to each other. And only then, fluent reading, which is the top academic ability that we would like our kids to have so they are able to understand and comprehend what they read, then it is achieved. And can we look at reading as an academic skill? This is my main research. I'm a reading researcher. We can look at it again as a continuum and see how all these brain regions related to language and cognitive control and literacy, and there are more, how they all communicate with each other. So, what does it mean about the child? Let's say that everything developed perfectly fine. We're at the 1st grade. We have our child ready to capture reading, to learn how to read, how hard it is to read. So let's talk a little bit about synchronization, because I keep talking about regions that communicate with each other, brain areas that talk to other brain areas. What does it mean? It has a term in neuroscience called synchronization, which is basically brain regions that talk to each other in a perfect timing. This is a Wikipedia definition. The scientific definition is really that the process of the stimuli, wherever it's coming from, usually it's from the auditory and the visual domains, need to be synced in a perfect manner. Perfect manner means accurately and in a timely manner, and it's not easy for the young child, for the young brain. So, synchronization, for those who are not familiar with this video, please don't tell your friends what's happening at the end. And this is not a ChatGPT or any kind of generative AI video. You see by the colors, it's very old, it's very vintage. Systems like to get into a synchronization. And you'll see beautifully how it happens spontaneously. Okay, so reading is also a form of synchronization. Why? Because areas of our auditory processing, language, and regions in our visual cortex, seeing, need to get the information together in a synchronized manner. It needs to happen fast. Different reading models suggested that in order to be able to read, you just easily, and that's why it's called the simple view of reading model, very simple, easy to read, very intuitive. You need to see something, you need to hear something, and voila, you comprehend what you read. We know today that it's really not simple. In order to be able to read, you need to engage your executive functions, which is all the squares that you see around these basic mechanisms. What about fluency? You need to do it quickly enough, right? And only then you're able to read. And you see all the brain networks that support this ability. We see from earlier studies from our lab that Also, when you process stories, which is very simple, we tell stories to our kids, brain regions related to all these networks that we talked about earlier, executive functions, sensory processing, auditory, and also cognitive control, all of them need to be synchronized when a child is just listening to a story. You see here a longitudinal study of more than 12 years of the same kids listening to stories from the age of 5 to the age of 18, and you see in the middle these networks that are getting more connected while children listen to stories over age. This increased connection or synchronization between networks was related to also better reading fluency at the age of 18. So you listen to stories more, you're synchronizing your brain more in these critical regions, and then you're able to read more fluently. My colleague and friend, Dr. John Hudden, had several studies looking at how important the environment is, and he found that children that are listening to more stories and get more engaged parents when they're telling them the stories are able to engage even in the scanner brain regions related to cognitive ability and also to imagination or visual processing, even when the kids are not seeing anything in the scanner. So this is pretty magical. But then we moved on to our next study, asking, well, is it really important that it's a real book, traditional book with papers, printed book, or is it okay if this is a visual one with animation, more like a movie on the screen? Okay, so sorry about that. So what we found in this study is that when we're watching a video on the screen, there is a less engagement of brain regions and networks related to directing attention and visualization, which is basically the opposite of what we found in the scanner when kids were exposed to most stories told by their parents engagingly from a physical book. So what's happening when synchronization is interrupted, basically, in the child? So several studies, including our own, showed some relations between white matter organization. White matter are the connections between the cells that's supposed to transmit the electrical activity. The organization of these brain neural tract was less optimal in kids that were exposed to more screen time from age 3 to 5. And I will skip a little bit because I'm running out of time. And I can tell you that each study brings up another question where I was saying, okay, is it the exposure? Is it okay that it's just there? And so we were running another study looking at a little bit of an older kids, doing a very simple task, seeing blue car, red car, blue car, red car. You just need to click the button. And we looked at their brain activation while they were doing that with the presence of a smartphone next to them and without the presence. And we found that their theta band, using EEG, theta band was significantly different and was related to lower attention capacity when the phone was present. We looked at the differences in reading from the screen versus reading from a paper, and a little bit of older kids wearing EEG, wearing their brain caps, or brain measurement caps, and we found that when kids were reading from the screen versus from a printed paper, the level of cognitive load was higher for these kids. In older kids, we found that increased screen exposure was related to a lower functional connection, so a lower synchronization between these brain regions related to visual processing and other brain regions related to cognitive control, as opposed to longer reading time from a printed book. And that echoes additional studies from the ABCD data. For those who are familiar with it, it's a very, very large corpus of 10,000 kids that showed similar trajectory of results. So I will move really quickly just to show you a tiny bit of results looking at parent-child interaction, which is also very, very important. We know that this what facilitates the interaction of the kid with socially and with other friends in development. So we're focusing on the parent and child. I can tell you that in the lab, it's really hard to measure relationship in the lab, right? Because this is something that is very natural. We're trying to stimulate the conversation between parent and child, especially the mothers. Fortunately, fathers are not coming a lot to the lab, so fathers, please come over. And we're using stories. It usually looks like this. I wanted to show you because some groups that I'm showing this, they're saying, well, you cannot really talk to a child. You cannot read a story to a child. And I think that, yes, you can. And this is just an example of me telling a story to a 9-month-old. You see the level of attention, right? You don't even have to understand the language to see the gestures and how much she is tuned towards the story. And I like this part more because she is going back to the book, which is quite amazing. So using this, we can look at parent-child interaction and synchronization in their brains. How do we do that? We're putting 2 EEG caps on the parent and the child. And so this is how it looks like. The 2 caps are synchronized, so we can look at the level of interaction between parent and child by looking at their brains. And what we found that an interactive storytelling increases the level of synchronization between the parent and child, which is what you see here. The yellow color means a higher synchronization level. Now, what's happening during interaction? So when I was using the phone over there, just sending some messages, the team sent some messages. The messages were trivia questions, so I really had to attend and answer and then go back. The level of synchronization went significantly down, as you see here. It is all listed in this paper. You're more than welcome to read it. I just don't have the time. I can tell you that when we looked at the synchronization between the parent and the child when they read a physical book versus a tablet, the synchronization went down in the tablet. We can talk about why afterwards in the Q&A session, but that was very interesting to look at this lower synchronization for that. So, to sum up, the first years of life are critical for the facilitation of these basic foundations that will serve the child throughout the child's life. Cognitive and sensory networks in the child participate in story listening, participate in academic abilities, participate basically in everything in life. So it's important to fuel them and to nurture them. Parental visualization and child monitoring cognitive abilities are associated with the better child language development. And the presence of technology and digital media may interfere just because it's there. The response may be different for different age groups. It's specific to the age groups that I looked at, but there may be different performance in older kids, and interruptions, even short ones, may interfere the child and may interfere the interaction between the child and the parent. Now, I really wanted to show you this, so I kept it to the end. In our lab, we're super curious, and generative AI, it feels like it's been here forever, but it's not. It's really a new technology. So we wanted to know whether children speaking to ChatGPT have a different engagement in their brains than in adults. Here is what we did. It was really hard to set that up. As you can imagine, it was a technical thing. The child is in the scanner, talking to ChatGPT in Hebrew, sorry. You see chat here on the screen, and you barely hear the scanner, which is quite amazing. And what's happening is the child got some sort, I will stop that for a second. The child got, can you go backwards? Sorry. The child got a mission to open a store. Can open any store the child wants, whatever it is. You can commercialize, you can do whatever you want. Talk to the smartest computer ever to help you out with this. Adults received the same exact instruction. Here is what we found neuroimaging-wise. Whereas you remember the default mode network that we talked about earlier, it's the left network on the screen. in adults and in individuals without attention difficulties, when this network is on, it's usually like a white noise. So other networks will go up. They have this opposite directions of activation. What we found here in kids, what you see the line in blue. In kids, both of them are up, which is something that we see in attention difficulties. In adults, when one is up, the other one is down. This is very, very preliminary. We're still collecting more data, but it does mean that it's not that one suit fits all. We need to think about what fits to each age group, and we're talking here about 6-year-old kids. Maybe they're too young for this. Robots. Can we use robots to tell stories? Is it better? Is it worse? We're still looking into this. I wanted to thank you for your attention and to thank all the team that is really doing this marvelous work in different places in the world, and thank you for your attention.
Okay, wonderful. So I'm delighted to follow that wonderful presentation about childhood mostly to talk a bit about adolescence. These are my disclosures. Sorry, is the clicker not working? Wonderful. So the key message I want to leave you with is that really, sorry, struggling with the clicker. The clicker. That would explain it, thank you. Adolescence is a window of opportunity. It's really a time of remarkable growth. And from the ages of 10 to 25, it's a time when we discover, learn from, and adapt to the world around us, where we forge our sense of who we are and who we aspire to be, where we learn to make decisions, manage our emotions, and create deeper connections with others and our communities. We also build resilience and develop interests, passions, and meaningful goals that shape our adult lives. And our developing brains are actually well suited to all of these tasks, but often the systems around young people are not. So it's not surprising that adolescence is really a time of mental health vulnerability, which of course is associated with a host of things. One is bodily changes and brain remodeling, the psychological transitions that young people go through, the social transitions, and the many milestones that we go through in adolescence. Of course, this has been around forever in our human history, but for the last maybe 30, 20 years, all of these processes, which are so important, are also interacting with technology. And today, I would love to talk about all of these things, but today I'll focus on brain remodeling. So we got a wonderful introduction about brain development in adolescence. This is a bit of a continuation. There's major changes in structure, function, and connectivity, as Tzipi was talking about. And adolescence, second to the first 2 years of life, is really a time of remarkable plasticity. And plasticity can be great. Adolescents have a lot of flexibility. They adapt and learn very quickly. They're prepared to meet the many social, emotional, and cognitive demands. And they're very well poised to benefit from the opportunities on the online world. At the same time, a very plastic brain is also vulnerable, right? They're vulnerable to negative risk-taking, to mental health, as I said, disorders, and to the harms that could come up in the digital world. So when we look at brains from 0 to 80 years of age, we see these trajectories of gray matter. We see that gray matter peaks in early childhood and then goes down in adolescence, but white matter, the connection between regions, really starts to go up in adolescence. And these changes, as Tzipi mentioned, are reflecting a lot of things that are happening at the cellular level. And what's important, and again, Tzipi also mentioned this, is that different brain regions are maturing at different rates. So I'll talk about these regions in the talk. So we know that earlier maturing regions have to do with social sensitivity and reward processing. So by the ages of 15, 16, adolescent brains are very sensitive to social information and to rewards. It'll take another 10 years for the cognitive control systems and the social cognition systems to be fully in line. So what this means is that we have, perhaps, if a good analogy would be that of a very powerful sports car. right? An adolescent brain has a very powerful motor, very powerful accelerator, but the brake is still coming in line until very late, 25, 26 years of age. Well, I'll go into a bit of the few brain studies that we have studying the impact of technology, but I do want to start with some methodological considerations. First is that in this field, my colleagues and I were asking two types of questions. So the first question is, are certain features of the adolescent brain or the child's brain and their psychological development, are these making them more susceptible to digital media? And a related question is, actually, can digital media shape or this famous rewiring of the brain and how it's developing over time? And I want to really separate these two questions because different studies get at different things. And as Tzipi mentioned, we can talk about, with the same machine, the MRI scanner, we can get at the function of the brain. So I'll present briefly some task studies, some connectivity studies. We can also measure the structure of the brain, as Tzipi mentioned, and I'll point out to a few studies doing this. And of course, there's other wonderful methods that I won't be talking about in this presentation, including EEG, which Tzipi was mentioning. When we talk about the limitations of these neuroimaging methods, there's mostly cross-sectional studies. As you know, cross-sectional studies don't help us determine causality, and it's hard to rule out confounding factors when we just have cross-sectional data. There's few longitudinal studies, which are really the gold standard, what we need to study the brain development. And this is changing. As I was reviewing the literature, more and more studies using the ABCD sample are starting to emerge. The ABCD sample is one of the greatest data sets that we have as a scientific community. It's really remarkable, but it has its challenges. ABC mostly measures screen time and measures dysregulated use. So all the studies are going to be limited by this. We'll talk about functional studies. Of course, as Tzipi showed you, trying to resolve a task standing very still inside a scanner is not really very ecological. It's not how we use media in real world. Most of our data is coming from observational studies, so limits our causal inference. And of course, which countries, which universities have access to these types of devices? They're very expensive infrastructure. So many countries in the world, many youth around the world are not represented in this data. Okay, so I'll start with a short survey of the functional studies. So first I'll start with studies that have actually put people in scanners to do tasks and measure brain activation. And of course, the landmark study was conducted by Lauren Sherman a few years ago, where she actually designed sort of a fake Facebook, and young people were either receiving or getting likes. And this study, I think, opened our whole field of study, showing that actually, yes, likes activate reward regions of the brain, the ventral striatum, a lot of subcortical regions, and similarly to monetary incentives or social incentives that we typically use in these experiments. So yes, likes do seem to affect reward systems in the brain. More recently, Maria Massa and colleagues have actually asked, well, what happens when someone is using social media a lot, what they call habitual checking of social media? And it's interesting because in this study, they have 2 time points. So in the first time point, participants are doing a task where they're anticipating social feedback. And those participants who in their lives use social media more, at time 1, their brain regions were underactivated. Many of the brain regions in reward, some of the prefrontal regions were underactivated. But when the kids came back 3 years later, those kids who were habitual checkers of social media actually saw the biggest increases in activation. It's that dark blue line over there. When you see that, this starts to give us evidence that maybe reward systems are becoming more sensitive in those who use social media the most. Then we had the other question, well, are actually adolescents more sensitive to features of social media? And this wonderful study by Ana da Pino, recently published, really recommend this study. It's a titanic task. She looked at 2 million Instagram posts, actual Instagram data. First, she shows that yes, adolescents are getting more likes in this data. And also, when she's using these very advanced computational modeling techniques, she actually gets the evidence that adolescents have a higher learning rate from likes. So yes, adolescents are more sensitive than adults to these likes on social media. And interestingly, this sensitivity to likes predicts how much adolescents' mood will change over the course of an experiment. So this is giving us empirical data that adolescents are more sensitive to social media likes in particular. There's other very interesting neural processes being studied. You'll have the pleasure of hearing from Dr. Jennifer Silks about her new chat room interact task. Elizabeth McNeely, a colleague, is looking at individual differences in self-disclosure in the scanner. And I know there's other people in Jason Chain's lab who are looking at sensitivity to social acceptance, rejection, and ambiguity. Very new work in progress. We'll be excited to see what happens. When we look at the functional studies connectivity, as Tzipi was mentioning, the message is mixed. I found 2 studies. So the first one is using ABCD data. And instead of looking at particular regions, they are looking at the whole system of regions, how they're connected. So in this first study in the ABCD, they actually did find 2 groups where the group that had higher use of screen time seemed to have a more disorganized brain network. However, the authors caution against overinterpretation because these groups were not stable over time and they were not associated with any cognitive measures or any mental well-being. So the authors of this paper, their takeaway is that there's no impact of screen media on the adolescent functional brain organization. Interestingly, with the ABCD, a lot of teams can work on them. So another study finds perhaps different interpretation. So it's the same data set using different clustering methods. And actually, when they look at adolescents who are consuming a lot of video, so YouTube streaming, in these adolescents, they do find that they have poor neurocognitive performance, more behavioral problems, and they do find hyperconnection of some regions, particularly reward, and some hypoconnections of some regions. There's a lot of regions there, so it's complex associations. But also, these networks were not super stable over time. So already I'm showing you 2 studies with the same data set finding conflicting things. I'll quickly move into the structural studies. So the first one is looking at volume, surface area, and thickness of the brain. This was the first study done with the ABCD in 2019, and they found that more screen time was associated with cortical thickness, which we would think of somewhat accelerated development and gray matter reductions. This was found in 9 and 10-year-olds, so not really fully adolescents, and they found that greater screen involvement was associated to greater levels of externalizing psychopathology, lower crystallized intelligence, and widespread cortical thickness. But the patterns that they found were different depending on the type of screen media. Something similar was also found in the ABCD, looking at different things, where social media and video games have different effects on the cerebellum, a region that really wasn't predicted from the offset. So this shows us that different screen media have different effects, and that there's other perhaps key players that we haven't really been thinking about, such as the cerebellum. The third study that I want to point out is also from the Pino, and in those same people who had a lot of Instagram posts, 5 years of Instagram post activities, they found that there are certain regions of the brain that are sensitive to this feedback, to this social feedback. And interestingly, in her study, she finds the reward regions are associated, but also the amygdala. So we're already seeing some new key players in the field. And lastly, you can also look at the tract using diffusion in structural MRI. And unfortunately, we don't have any work so far. I do want to point towards John Kruper, a student in my department. I am collaborating with his supervisor, Ariel Rokem, and we're going to try to look at the tracts connecting brain regions, the visual tracts and the reward tracts in the ABCD, but this work is very much in progress, so please stay tuned. So in summary, to answer our first question, do certain features of the adolescent brain and psychological development make them more susceptible to digital media? I think yes. Adolescent brains develop in 3 key ways, as I said: more sensitive to social environments. Adolescent brains are more sensitive to the thrilling and exciting activities. And adolescent brains are still developing their capacity to regulate the self, to regulate impulse control and task. And I do think that design features of social media, we have some evidence that they're uniquely appealing to these types of things. We have social likes, we have rewards, we have features like autoplay and endless scrolling that make it harder for adolescents to be in charge of what they're doing online. The second question is harder to answer. Ours is digital media rewiring the brain? Yes, but. So I think I'm now convinced that there might be some rewiring of the reward processing areas after reviewing this literature. There seems to be evidence that these areas are becoming more sensitive the more social media people use. And there's some evidence of accelerated development in these areas. For the brakes of the car, it's unclear. Evidence is quite mixed. I think we all went to try to find these associations, and they're not as clear as the reward associations. And there's other potential areas we haven't explored, sensory areas, the amygdala and the cerebellum. And there's a lot of caveats, right? This is very new, a very emerging field with several methodological limitations, as I said. And let's also remember that any repeated exposure will change our brains. It could be good repeated exposure, such as learning to read, that will change our brains. Deprivation will change our brains in negative ways. Exercising, anything we'll do will change our brains. So it's not surprising that digital media use could change our brains. What does that mean? We don't know. The effects are not straightforward. They vary in magnitude, in direction, and differ by type of digital media. The clinical and behavioral consequences of these changes are not clear. The long-term implications aren't clear. And we need, of course, richer characterization of positive and negative experiences online and longer follow-ups. With that, I want to thank you and my lab for your attention.
Great, thank you so much. How cool are they? This was so cool. I know. I'm going to do this from now on. I'm not presenting my own work. I'm going to invite really awesome people to present the work I want to hear about. Thank you so much. So we have just a few minutes left for questions, and there's a QR code. If those of you who are in the audience have a question, you can jump in and type that in very quickly, and I will try to get to it very quickly. We won't have time to get to everything. But while you're entering things, why don't I start with a question that I have while you're typing. One of the questions that I have is, I'm just going to merge two together, and you can choose which one you each want to respond to. One is, what do you see as the most promising or most exciting next step for this kind of work, developmental neuroscience work that takes a developmental lens and neuroscientific tools and tries to answer questions about the intersection with digital media use? So the greatest potential or opportunity. The other potential question is, what do you see as the biggest barrier or challenge either in doing this kind of research or in like how we all interpret it when we're not in this field? Greatest challenge or greatest opportunity? Tzipi, do you want to start?
Sure. Wow. So first of all, I'll start with the challenge and I'll end with an opportunity. I think that one of the challenges is that measuring screen technology exposure, it's so hard right now. It was easier when it was less spreaded, when this technology was super expensive and then not everybody could afford it all the time. It is now so available and you can meet it everywhere that how can you really capture the time, and not only the time, the content and the type, right? Because some educators will say, well, ed tech might be helpful, right? And I agree, it might be helpful. But what exactly kids are using also in school? I think that there's no even standard way of looking at that. So I think this is the main challenge, how to capture the time, capture the type along development. And the developmental aspect is super important. What fits 15-year-old child will not fit a 6-year-old child. This is what we try to show in the ChatGPT study that we showed. And the opportunities, I think the opportunities are endless. Neuroimaging data has its limitation, as Lucy said, but it does can provide potentially some mechanistic understanding of what is happening during the use of it, during the use of screens in different age groups. We need to think about how to run it. Like, there are methodological difficulties here, but it is possible, and I think this is the promise.
That's great. So in some ways, the greatest challenge is the challenge that plagues the entire field, right? How do we capture the whole digital ecology that's happening, content and all those things? And I'm pretty sure there's a panel later in the conference on measurement, so I'll be at that one. Lucía, would you add anything?
Well, I completely agree, and I think this tension sort of came through in my slides. On the one hand, there is this smaller functional MRI studies which are designing good tasks that more closely mimic what happens online. But on the other hand, we have these very large studies like the ABCD, which is great. That's what we need in terms of longitudinal development, following kids for 10 years. But of course, the ABCD is measuring so many things that the few questions they can have on screens are not really fully characterizing what we're seeing. And of course, the other biggest challenge is that we know that most youth in this world are growing up in the majority world, so outside the US and Europe. And we're not capturing them at all because it is really prohibitive to run these types of studies in the majority world. So there's a lot of their experiences that we're not capturing. So that for me is a big challenge. I see some promise in more of these mobile, cheaper type studies like FNIRS, which is a newer technology. I think some of these can be done in lower resource settings. So I think there's some promise there, but of course we're just in the beginning.
Thank you so much. That's excellent. And we can see there are questions coming in, and you do have the opportunity to upvote, I think, if there are questions that several people have. I chose a really bad seat because I'm as far from the screen as possible, and part of the box is blocking my view. So I'm going to do my best to read what's there. So why do you think that ebook reading is different than, I assume, print book reading? So why might that difference exist? And what can parents do to reduce that difference?
Wow. So, what I'm going to say now are our interpretation of that, right? So we believe, and we can prove that, but we have not done that yet, that there is some sort of an expectation for something that will pop, something that will happen, aside from what's happening in the book, that is happening during ebook reading. Kids are waiting for pop-ups, or they want to touch it. They're less interested in the book. It's the tablet thing. And interestingly enough, we had a study that kind of interviewed, just as a spin-off, interviewed children with parents just using the screens. It wasn't an EEG study. It was just something to explain what we found. And what kids said when we mocked the study that we did with EEG, they said that they want to hold it. They want to see what will happen next. Whereas the parents are actually struggling with what's happening in that ebook, like they're pushing something, it becomes smaller, zooming in, zooming out. So the whole interaction becomes about the tablet and less about the communication, the eye contact that is happening with the child during a printed book. I don't want to say real book because everything is real book, but a printed book. Something else is happening during this interaction, and this is why we think we found these differences between ebooks and printed books.
That's great. And so what I'm hearing maybe implicitly there is that maybe a child-centered and family-centered design approach to build ebooks that are maybe more sensitive to all of these kinds of challenges you've described could maybe bridge that gap a little bit. Agree or disagree? Do you think that's true?
So I think that if, like instructions, sometimes we don't need to instruct parents how to read books for their kids regularly, but there is a dialogic reading method that we actually provide some examples and model parents how to read to their kids, even with printed books. Maybe we should do the same as you suggest with ebooks. Once you're holding this is what you may choose doing, and then maybe that will improve the interaction during ebook reading. And one additional comment, some parents think that even reading from the smartphone is okay because it's reading. No, this is a super small screen. It's not necessarily adapted to the child field of view. So it's also important what device you're using when you read the book for this child.
That's great. Okay, I think we've got time for maybe one more. So this is what I see on here on my phone. Of course, brain science is important, but what role should more subjective assessments, like teens feeling that their brains are changing, so their subjective experience, what role should that play in this space? Maybe Lucía, I'll start with you.
Well, yeah, I think that's a good reminder that these whole conversations we're having about digital media, young people are very sensitive to them, right? They're absorbing these messages of guilt. They're absorbing these messages of shame about what they're doing. Many of them are using this word addiction early on in their lives, which we should push against, right? It's a big label to carry as a young person. But I do point towards how we could flip, and I'm sure they're also getting the message that social media is harming their brains. But we can also flip the script, right? There's other interventions to promote growth mindset where we teach young people about how plastic their brains are, right? Your brains can change, they can adapt, they can repair if you're set up in a positive, scaffolded environment, right? So I think flipping the question, of course, recognizing adolescents' experience with, and children's experiences with all of this, having open and honest conversations with them, and letting them know how powerful of a brain they're carrying inside their skulls and how much they can adapt to the world around them. But of course, understanding that they're still developing and they still need scaffolding from their environment, their families, educators, of course, regulation, and the call for age-appropriate design that I think we'll keep hearing throughout presentations today. Big tech companies know all of these things about brain science, psychological science. They use it to make their products uniquely appealing to young people. How can we fight against that, knowing what we know about some vulnerabilities in young people?
That's a great question. Yes, that's a great question for all of us to think about, I think. And we're out of time, but I think one question we can maybe leave with is thinking about that design question. If you were to design a platform, whether it's streaming video for little kids or social media for teens and tweens, how might that design look different if you're designing to support rather than exploit the developmental state of the brain at any given point? So we don't have time to discuss that, but I will say Tzipi and Lucía will both be in one of the breakout sessions later in the day. So if you want to connect with them more, learn from them, engage in conversation around this topic, that would be a great place to go. Please join me in thanking our fantastic presenters.